so excited to have Susan Kerns here to talk about her work, gender, sexuality in comics, and so much more. Susan Kerns is professor at Columbia College in Chicago in the Cinema and Television Arts Department. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me be part of this.
So, Susan, you have had, oh my goodness, like quite a journey. And you are like producer and writer and director of films, and you work in comic studies, but like, how does all this come together? How did you get here?
Well, I'll tell you. So I went to a PhD program at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee called Modern Studies, and it was very interdisciplinary. And that was really what I needed and what I wanted as somebody. I kind of can't sit still. And so I wanted to, obviously like be writing, but I also wanted to be working in film, making film, that kind of thing. And I feel like popular culture in general is such a, everything interconnects in some way. And so I wanted a program that really honored that for my PhD, and I was very lucky to find it. So I don't know that I got into comic studies exactly that way, but it kind of primed me for being very excited about the opportunity to get into comic studies when it presented itself to me. So what happened was that this was maybe 5 years or so ago now. One of my colleagues was meant to teach a course on adaptation and comic books and graphic novels, and I can't remember why, but for some reason couldn't do it. And he was like, "Hey, would you have any interest in teaching this?" And so basically I was thinking about how throughout my life I've gone through periods where I've read a lot of comic books and graphic novels and just got really excited about the opportunity to do it. And then started thinking about the movies I could show. And so it was really Tank Girl that kind of sealed the deal. I was like, well, how can I not like show this movie to college students? And truthfully, I'm one of like the 4 people that saw Tank Girl in the theater when it first came out. And I think I might have been one of the only people that just like unabashedly loved it in the theater. And oddly, I took a course, a year or 2 later about feminist film theory, and we had to watch Tank Girl again for that class. And so it's always been just it is not a perfect film by any means, but it's always been a film that I've just really had this fondness for. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And one of the things I love about being an academic is that I get to get excited about things with my students as I'm teaching it. So it was really having a full semester of being able to dive into what it means to study comics and what it means to think about the relationship between comics and the film form that got me excited to start writing about comics as well. So that's really where it started, but I see the sideshow banner is up. My dissertation is on conjoined twins. And so when I was writing that, I really started studying sideshows. And obviously there's a natural connection as well between thinking about sideshows and how they present people who are interesting with, origin stories and things like that. And there's a real connection between sideshows and, what we see in a lot of superhero films, but also the way that comics are kind of laid out. Are you familiar with the term 10 in 1?
No.
So 10 in 1 is like, you see the tent here in the background. A 10 in 1 sideshow is when you would go in and there would literally be 10 acts under like one tent. And so it was almost like flipping the page. It's like you could go see this person and hear their story and, maybe ask some questions, or maybe you weren't interested and then you just move on to the next thing. But there was this definite connection between, the narrative being presented, the visual that you're seeing, and then so much about sideshows and how they're interpreted being interpreted happened in the audience member, whether they felt like it was, you know, obviously some of it was really rooted in exploitation. Other was really about performance and just all of these different things that were happening in this performance space. So I also teach sideshow classes or sideshow cinema and sometimes literature as well. And I've had a number of students over the years write about like The Incredibles, and how The Incredibles is similar to the novel Love, in that it's kind of this family that's creating a family of people with different sorts of bodies and abilities. And so I
Right.
think it all kind of comes together in a weird way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is this real strong tradition in comics, right, where it has been kind of, on the one hand, a space of creating kind of interest through the spectacle, but also a space for creators who felt like themselves the object of being a spectacle, kind of retaking over, right, that space, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's interesting thinking about the place of both of these things in academia itself. Obviously for a long time, people didn't think comics were sort of worthy of study or worthy of, uh, like teaching a whole class about, or even worthy of making into movies, which is crazy to think about now. But it's the same kind of thing, like really trying to dismantle ideas of what it means to be high culture and low culture and all of that. Like I feel like it's all on the table and all very worthwhile.
So you've already kind of started showing us some synergies and overlaps, but yeah, do you want to develop a little more? You've talked about your course on kind of adaptation, the sort of sideshow and the tent sort of effect, right? But yeah, what else are you seeing here?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about making film is that even though obviously digital is much different than celluloid, most people, when you're thinking about making a film, are still thinking about it frame by frame by frame. So I pulled this image. This is actually the back of the Pretty in Pink soundtrack album. And I would also maybe locate some of my interest here, just because I had this album when I was young, and I remember seeing the successive like storytelling in it, and just like being fascinated with these very small strips of film here. And you can see it's like from panel to panel or frame to frame. Sometimes nothing changes, and sometimes everything changes, and sometimes the most subtle change becomes the most important change. And I think filmmakers still think about that, like how can we put all of this information in a frame, and make every frame matter. And whether it's making every frame like tell a story, like, looking at this, you learn so much about Annie Potts' character from her bedroom here, with the checkerboard floor and everything. Like, how can you make production design count versus, how can you make character interaction count? And there's such a natural relationship between that and what we see in comics. And, the different styles of how people fill up their panels to have character information or information about the world or information about the action. I find it all really exciting and truthfully very impressive.
Susan, do you thumbnail at all when you kind of, or in your, even if it's imagined thumbnails, or do you sketch when you're kind of creating a film script?
Sometimes I attempt to sketch and it's pretty abysmal. But I am lucky that they have like storyboarding programs and things like that now. But there are people, like, was it Parasite that just released all of those beautiful storyboards a couple of months ago? I'm so impressed by that, by people who can do that. Hitchcock was a big, advocate for like having everything sketched out in advance. I am not quite that disciplined, but I do think it's incredibly helpful. And again, just thinking about also with film, you really want to plan out what you're doing before you get to set, because you have so many people on set waiting, to help you, that you don't want to waste what is very precious time trying to figure out like what you're going to do in that moment. So it's also a very pragmatic approach, but storyboards are beautiful. I mean, storyboard art is just incredible.
Yeah, there's so many examples. When I wrote my book on Robert Rodriguez, I think when with the constraint, the money constraint, basically forcing you to really work everything out in advance, making actually for finally a better product, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So Lossonomy, tell
Yeah.
me about this. What is this? I don't know what this is. Lossonomy.
You're not alone. So I included this because so the documentary that I produced recently called Man Life is all about the last follower of Lossonomy and the Lawsonian religion. So in a nutshell, Lawsonomy was like a utopian movement that came out of so aviation pioneer Alfred Lawson, he legitimately invented the first US passenger airliner. And this was before the Great Depression hit. And during the Great Depression, he started an economic movement called the Direct Credit Society. And then afterwards, it turned into a religion called Lawsonomy. So he had, Maroh was the gentleman that we spent a lot of time with, and he passed away a couple of years ago. But basically, Maroh was still spending every day of his life trying to get people to read the writings of Alfred Lawson and to like understand direct credits and like trying to change the economic system to benefit, more working class people. But the reason I bring it up here is because one of the things I wasn't expecting about Lawsonomy was how he also used comics to spread his story. So he primarily, Alfred Lawson primarily wrote books and sold books, and they're pretty dense. Like it's tough to get through some of them. But he had this benefactor newspaper and was also trying to tell the story of what he was trying to do with comics in the benefactor newspapers. And he also had like these little chapbooks for kids that were all comics oriented. And I just thought that was really interesting how he was really trying to tap into not just the textual, and he obviously gave speeches and things like that too, but really also trying to bring people in through visuals and through drawings like this one. So
Are you seeing that comics today, given that so much is driven by the visual, I mean, so much of our narratives that we consume, I mean, it's not just going to the cinema anymore or TV, it's like we're walking around with like these visual narratives, right? Constantly in our presence. Is it something,
yeah.
obviously there's something here, right? With him kind of clued into this and then people really like profiting from, right? Our kind of visual, it's almost like the heart that beats in our chest, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, truthfully, I think that, if we were having a longer conversation, I feel like the definition of literacy really needs to start changing at some point, because literacy is obviously about reading and writing, but as you're saying, it's also about visual literacy in so many ways, whether it's video or whether it's drawings or, just the amount of information that we are constantly soaking in. It seems like, young people both want to know how to create those sorts of things, but also need to know how to read it differently. And not just young people, older people as well. I mean, we're learning this too, but it is really this idea of like literacy as being tied to text, I think is quite antiquated and something that there should probably be a reckoning with, fairly soon.
So yeah, tell us about some of your research in and around the issues of gender and sexuality. I know you've done research on meat cake. So yeah, let's go on this part of your journey.
Sure. So the reason I started writing about meat cake was because of Hindrance and Perfidia, the conjoined twin characters in meat cake. So I had the opportunity to write for a special collection on freaked and othered bodies in comics. And since my background in sideshow studies is really about representations of conjoined twins, I was really excited to be able to talk about meat cake, because in what I had written before, it was almost primarily film and television or old like sideshow photo cards, because there is a real relationship between how those visual representations, those souvenirs, sort of carried over into film. But what I love about meat cake is that Dame Darcy, is not bound to kind of the rules of not even just real bodies, but what real bodies can get away with on film or in film and television. And so this is one of the panels here, where they're both engaged in a sexual encounter with one of their many suitors, and there's just no shame about it. There's no like questioning of like, should they both be here? What does this mean? Or, you know, how do we save them from themselves, or like, you know, hide this from heteronormative people, you know, all of that. So it's like, it seems like such a simple thing, but it really ends up breaking down all of these barriers that are put up for conjoined twins in other types of popular culture representations. So especially women conjoined twins. If you've seen like Twin Falls, Idaho, or even something like Stuck on You, this should not come as a surprise that male conjoined twins are sort of more able to have sexuality and sex lives and than female conjoined twins. So
yeah,
so I
totally.
found that really exciting.
It's interesting too that, you know, different kind of conventions of that have attached themselves to different media allow for, you know, certain kinds of representations of sexuality, and others disallow those representations. And comics as a space for really kind of opening up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, when Dame Darcy was originally writing Meat Cake too, it was, you know, the women who were making comics were also in a way very free to do what they wanted to do, because truthfully nobody was taking them seriously, you know, so it was very niche, and so it gave them more freedom to kind of play and develop their own style and their own stories and things like that. And, you know, it's both really exciting, but also, you know, kind of insane that it took that long for women to start to carve out their place.
So why gender in comics? And clearly this probably is a good indication, right?
Well, truthfully, I chose this because I got into comics fairly late, I guess, and part of it was the intimidation of the store itself. So that's why I was looking for, I was looking just for like a representation of kind of a normal comic book store. And part of it is that, you know, you're overwhelmed with information. Like if you're not going in specifically looking for something, you're just like, oh my God, where do I start? But being a young girl, when I was entering into these spaces, it was really hard for me to feel not exactly safe, but welcome. And part of it was that I don't think I ever saw a girl working at a comic book store until I was in my late 20s. And so that was certainly, I'm sure, part of it, but also the stories. Like people were, you know, really encouraging me, like, oh, you should really read Batman, you're gonna love it, or Sin City, or, you know, even Watchmen. Like when I was younger and tried to read Watchmen, I was just like, this just isn't for me. And so it felt like this whole world that I was very intrigued by and really wanted to be a part of. And I struggled to find a way into it. And I think that gender has a lot to do with that. And so I think that it's, you know, it's a conversation that we're opening up now in terms of, you know, mostly primarily in stories. And I don't know, do you know, has anyone written about the actual space of the comic book store?
I mean, it's been written on more in terms of comics history, but not in terms of its kind of being gendered and very kind of straight jacketing, very kind of straight, white guy ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure somebody's out there writing something, you know, much smarter than what I could say, but I think it's a real thing. And you know, and truthfully, like record stores had the same thing. It's There's something about the space that becomes intimidating and alienating that you have to decide if you want to break through that.
In a way, the Comicsgate stuff is a kind of last bastion of kind of defense of, this space, which was traditionally very like straight white dude stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, this is Susan. It sounds like another project for you right here, right? The comic. um, but yeah, so death.
So death became my gateway. um, a friend introduced me to her as a character, and she didn't even mention she didn't mention Neil Gaiman. I don't think she even mentioned Sandman. It was just like she was obsessed with this character Death. And there was something about her look that was like, I need to just figure out more. I need to find out more about this character's world. And so that was really where I started to find my place in comics. So it was, I went in, I think I started with like The High Cost of Living, and then read that entire series in a weekend, and then just went back and bought like everything that I could afford, truthfully, to kind of catch up. And then I started buying the weekly Sandman as the series continued. But it really was, it was like I needed a character that really spoke to me, to kind of invite me into the world. And then once I was in, I was all in. So it became very exciting.
I think what you're describing is a kind of origin story for all of us. It's just that some of us had access to the spin racks when we were kids, but there was always that one like character, right? That kind of became our focus and that drew us in. Yeah, so then we jumped to Harley Quinn and Tank Girl, and gosh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this was, obviously Death existed before Harley Quinn did, but it did seem like there was, in the 90s, like things started to open up. Tank Girl emerges in the late 1980s, but Tank Girl was obviously a character I was very drawn to. And then, the Batman animated series also on television, I think helped draw more girls into that world, through like Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn. And, every once in a while they would do the episodes just about those two. At that time, I remember thinking like, I'm probably too old for this, but it also felt like everything I had ever wanted. So
yeah, I love that.
So then, then it's like those characters become very, very endearing to you. So
Yeah, and with Tank Girl, you've focused on that for this great collection that we're about to publish this summer on gender and sexuality in comics. What were some of the discoveries or what formulations once you've kind of focused in on Tank Girl?
Well, I think Tank Girl is so interesting, maybe similarly to Hindrance and Perfidia and Meat Cake, in that she's so open with her sexuality and just gets to express it. There's no trying to hide that she likes sex and that she's going to use sex and she's not going to apologize for it. And her moral compass is like all over the place. Like I'm not really sure it exists, but it's really, she's just very unapologetically herself. And one of the things I find really fascinating about Tank Girl is that even when I go back in and reread the comics, it's like I'm still hoping for like a linear story to emerge or something, and it never does. And I know that it won't, and I'm still looking for it. And I find that like oddly refreshing too. Like obviously it kind of has, punk rock sentiment to that sort of approach. But there is also something really, really interesting about not feeling like they had to develop her in that way, at least originally. So I find that really exciting. But the other thing I think is that Tank Girl is really the embodiment of contradiction in terms of, men obviously fetishize her, and I think women fetishize her differently. And I find that really interesting that she is all of those things to a lot of different kinds of people. And I think that speaks to, just the fact that they created a good character, an interesting character. So.
Right. Yeah, two men and, creators, right? And yet Tank Girl is somehow really complex in all these different ways that you've just described.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's hear we've heard about your recreation or your adaptation course. Let's hear about some other, I don't know, the Susan Kerns method of teaching comics.
Well, so when I teach comics, it is always in the context of film adaptation. So, but I think it's incredibly useful, especially for young filmmakers, to think about, how you're adapting something and what it means to adapt somebody else's work, and what things we talk a little bit about faithfulness, and how the idea of faithfulness doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything exactly the same, the different approaches to that, but also thinking about things like gender and sexuality, for example. So Blue is the Warmest Color is one of the texts that I really enjoy teaching. And so that is kind of a queer, touchstone for a lot of young people, and or at least readers in France at the time. It was French, or it is French. And so did I include an image of that one?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yep. There it is. Okay. So one of the things that I usually have them read this first before we watch the film. And one of the things I really like about it is the tactile quality. It has such a focus on bodies and skin, but with this beautiful watercolor approach. And it feels, very ethereal. It feels almost dreamlike. And that's in part because it's all memory. So when we talk about this as an adaptation, the film is really interesting because it's definitely faithful to this attention to skin and to this attention to the importance of body and all of that. But people often talk about it as more of like realism or verite, or sometimes, documentary. And yet the film, have you seen the film Blue is the Warmest Color?
I actually haven't.
Okay. It's terrific. It's really good. It's also very troubled by its production history. So basically you have this queer text that's put in the hands of a male director, and he preserves a lot of the attention of the visual, but it also very clearly has a male gaze. And so much so that, for example, it's also a very long movie, so I have my students watch it outside of class. I always tell my students, do not watch this with your parents. And inevitably there's one person who comes back and is like, I had to turn it off because I was watching it with my mom. And it's just why did you do that? But it's a really interesting study and adaptation because of the things that it gets so right, and because of the things that work so well. But then also it really becomes about, at times, the male look at female bodies. The production history is such that the actresses afterwards talked about the grueling kind of hours where they were just naked and not feeling like they were cared for as people. So that complicates it as well. But it's really thinking about sort of diving into how we can think about these texts in relationship to each other.
Yeah, I love it. I'm going to have to go watch that now. And then, of course, now I'm thinking I might need to put trigger warnings on my syllabus for the parents.
Yeah. Right.
Do not watch with your parent. And here's an example, right, from the film.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. I can already kind of guess how the camera lensing here is working to sexualize in ways that you don't have in the comic book. But
Oh, this is the tipping point. I mean,
okay. What are you working on these days?
well, I am working on a book-length manuscript about conjoined twins and representation in film. So that's my ongoing project. I also included a still here, which I thought was interesting. It's from a stereoscopic virtual reality project that we're working on called The Scapegoat. So it's a horror game experience, and this is a still from it. But basically, the idea of your partner is going to a party. They are very clearly not inviting you. And so you're very jealous. You're like, what's going to happen at this party? And as you start to play the game and you're collecting clues, trying to figure out, if your partner is cheating on you or not, you start to realize that, that all is not what it seems, and that maybe there are other things you should be afraid of. So it's sort of a full horror story, sort of a Wicker Man Midsummer.
This shot in particular, I'm scared. Like, and then going back to comics here for a second, the vitality, where you're seeing the vitality in comics themselves today. Like, where are you drawn to?
Well, I'll tell you, I thought a lot about this because I think that I am not the person to ask. And I grabbed a cover of Lumberjanes just because I like what Lumberjanes is trying to do. Like, it's a collective of women writing together, trying to be very inclusive in their drawings and in their characterization and all of that. I think that's the prevalence of that kind of approach is really exciting to me. And I'm very excited about, we were talking about comic book stores. I'm very excited to, every time I read about like Black owned comic book stores, I think that's awesome. Because even, looking at the images that I chose and like the characters that I connected to, it's all white girls, So I think that the vitality in comics today is that it really feels like it is expanding to be much more inclusive to many more kinds of people and kinds of stories and different, ages of readers. And that I find that really, I don't know, I'm very excited about the promise of comics.
I love that. Yeah. And I was just talking to Lee Francis Four, who runs Red Planet Bookstore, that's very focused on indigenous comics there in Albuquerque. Let me ask you this, because you're so like kind of in the space of film and comics. What was your response when Scorsese announced to the world that Marvel, like the MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe, was not cinema?
Well, I think, whatever, but, but I think what Scorsese is trying to fight for is the ability to continue making different kinds of films. So, so Scorsese, like obviously Netflix wouldn't have been his first choice for something like The Irishman, but studios aren't financing that kind of movie anymore. And so I think that's maybe more the point, is like, we need to remember that we like all kinds of movies, and that we don't want Disney, for example, to be the only studio that gets to make movies anymore, and it really does seem like that's kind of the direction that the industry is heading to, like big budget kids films, big budget, Marvel films, and we just don't want to lose voices like Scorsese's. So.
Right. No, I get it. Yeah, that makes sense to me. A lot more sense. Thank you for putting it in those terms, Susan. You've taken us on a very brief but wondrous journey through your life and your interface with comics, including one of my favorites, Tank Girl. So thank you, Susan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much again for inviting me to do this. It was a pleasure.